Picture a world where vast, open seas are ruled by fearless explorers, where longships cut through icy waves, and legends of conquest and adventure echo through the centuries. Now, imagine if I told you the true strength of the Vikings wasn't found in their swords or shields, but in the soil beneath their feet. What if I said that the very thing that fueled their epic journeys, that allowed them to settle harsh new lands from Greenland to the edges of Russia, wasn't battle, but agriculture? We often envision Viking warriors with axes raised, ready for plunder. But what if I showed you a different side of these legendary people? One where they traded the roar of battle for the rhythm of the seasons, where they held not a weapon, but a plow. Welcome, friends, to a story hidden in plain sight, one that reshapes everything we thought we knew about the Vikings. This is the untold tale of Viking Age farming, the quiet, sophisticated, and utterly vital foundation that made their daring voyages possible. Think about it. Without steady harvests, without advanced knowledge of the land and climate, without communities anchored by thriving farms, there would have been no wood for those iconic ships, no food for those long ocean crossings, no settlements that lasted generations in some of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. The real mystery isn't just how they raided, it's how they survived, thrived, and built an empire rooted in the earth itself. So join me as we step into the boots of a Viking farmer, as we walk the fields they tilled and uncover the brilliant, often overlooked innovations that define their daily lives. We're about to explore tools that defied their time, planting methods tailored to extreme weather, and community structures that turned barren landscapes into bread baskets. This journey will change how you see history itself, because sometimes the greatest adventures don't start with a battle cry, but with the first turn of the soil in spring. Let's begin. But to truly understand this world, we need to let go of our modern perspective of time. For the Viking farmer, the year wasn't measured in 12 equal months, but in two distinct, powerful seasons dictated by the sun and the soil. Their entire way of life pulsed to this ancient rhythm. There was the summer finding, a period from roughly April to October. This was the season of possibility, of long daylight hours. It was the time when the iconic longships could navigate the treacherous, ice-free seas. For some, this meant launching expeditions for trade, exploration, or yes, even raiding. But for the vast, silent majority of Norse people, this summer season was a furious, non-stop race against time. Every single day of sunlight was precious capital to be invested directly into the land. This was when they plowed, planted, tended, and harvested the intense, back-breaking work that would determine if their family would eat through the long dark to come. Then came the winter nights, marking the shift around October. This was the other half of the year, a much longer, inward-looking season defined by darkness and survival. The seas became impassable, freezing over or churning with violent storms. This was not the time for adventure, it was the time for hunkering down. The community's focus shifted entirely inward, to the farmstead, to the animals sheltered in the longhouse, and to the stored bounty from the summer's labor. This was when tools were repaired by the fire, when wool was spun into yarn for clothing, when stories and laws were passed down through generations. The success of this entire winter season, their very survival, depended entirely on how successful that frantic summer farming season had been. A poor harvest didn't just mean a few hungry nights, it meant starvation, the failure of the entire community, and the end of any dreams of launching ships come spring. So when we picture a Viking, we should not first see a warrior on a foreign beach. We should see a man or woman standing in a field at dawn, feeling the turn of the season in the air, knowing that their axe would be used to clear a stubborn tree root long before it might ever be raised in battle. The raid was a seasonal, high-risk opportunity for a select few. The farm was the constant, the absolute foundation for everyone. It was the fertile ground from which those legendary adventures could even grow. The silver, the silks, the slaves brought back from overseas, these were glittering extras. The real treasure, the non-negotiable currency of life, was always the barley in the storehouse, the hay in the barn, and the health of the livestock. Their identity wasn't forged solely in battle. It was cultivated, season after season, in the quiet, stubborn resilience of the homestead. At the very center of this seasonal struggle, the anchor of it all, stood the longhouse. This wasn't just a building, it was the living, breathing heart of the entire operation. Picture a sturdy, low-slung structure, its walls made of turf, wood, or stone, and a roof so thick with sod it seemed to rise directly from the earth itself. From the outside, it might have looked like a simple, even primitive, dwelling. But step inside, and you discover it was a meticulously organized command center for survival. The air inside was thick with the smell of wood smoke, drying herbs, and animals. Yes, animals, often. One end of the longhouse was dedicated to housing the farm's most valuable livestock during the brutal winter: cows, goats, and sheep. Their body heat helped warm the human family living at the other end, a perfect example of Viking practicality. This wasn't just a home, it was a barn, a workshop, a storage facility, and the social core of the family, all under one long, smoky roof. Every decision, every hope, and every fear for the future radiated out from this single, vital structure. And radiating out from the longhouse was the land itself, organized with a clear and purposeful hierarchy. The most precious real estate on any Viking farm was the area immediately surrounding the buildings, a plot of land known as the infield or home field. In Old Norse, this was called the tun, a word that still echoes in modern place names across the Nordic world, like the English town. This was not left to chance. The tun was always the best, most fertile soil on the property, carefully chosen and painstakingly improved over generations. It was the family's agricultural engine room, and it was protected like a treasure. You would almost always find it encircled by a sturdy stone wall or a strong wooden fence. This barrier was absolutely crucial. It served a single, vital purpose: to keep the valuable, hungry animals that were housed in the longhouse out of the most important crops. Within this protected sanctuary, the Vikings practiced what we might call intensive gardening on a grand scale. This is where they grew the crops that were absolutely essential to their diet and their economy. Barley was the superstar here, the backbone of their nutrition, used to make bread, porridge, and most importantly, the beer that was a daily staple for everyone. They also grew oats and rye, and cultivated hardy vegetables like cabbages, onions, peas, and beans. Every inch of this enclosed field was precious. Waste was not an option. The fertility of the tun was carefully maintained through a sophisticated system. They would deliberately move the animal pens around this infield so the manure would naturally fertilize the soil. They'd also collect every bit of waste from the farmstead: ash from the fire, food scraps, seaweed gathered from the shore, and compost it all back into this vital earth. This wasn't just farming, it was a closed-loop system of survival, a cycle of life and renewal that began and ended right at their doorstep. The strength of the tun directly dictated the strength of the family it supported. Now, while that precious tun was the agricultural heart of the farm, feeding the family was only one part of the equation. Just beyond that protective fence lay a much larger expanse of land known as the outfield. This was the wilder, rougher cousin to the carefully managed infield. The outfield wasn't enclosed or fertilized in the same intensive way. Instead, it was used for grazing livestock during the summer months and for harvesting one of the most critical resources for surviving the Norse winter: hay. This distinction between the infield and outfield wasn't just about geography. It represented a brilliant, two-tiered strategy for managing risk and maximizing every single resource the land could offer. But what exactly were they growing inside that vital, protected enclosure? Forget the image of endless fields of golden wheat waving in the breeze. The Viking pantry was built on much hardier, more resilient staples, perfectly adapted to their challenging climate. The undisputed king of the Viking field was barley. This wasn't just a crop, it was the absolute foundation of their entire diet and their culture. Barley is incredibly tough. It has a short growing season, it can handle poor soil, and it's resistant to frost, making it the perfect cereal for the unpredictable northern weather. From barley, they made a dense, dark bread that was a staple at every meal. They used it to create a thick, nourishing porridge that could simmer for hours over the longhouse fire. And perhaps most importantly, they used barley to brew beer. We have to understand that beer for the Vikings wasn't just a recreational drink. It was a vital source of calories and nutrition, and it was a central part of their social and religious life. It was a safer alternative to often contaminated water. The process of brewing also made the nutrients in the barley more accessible. A successful barley harvest meant the community would have bread, warmth, and the means to celebrate and bond together through the long winter. It was quite literally the currency of life. Alongside barley, they also cultivated oats and rye, especially in the cooler, more mountainous regions where barley might struggle. Rye, in particular, could produce a darker, even denser bread. But the fields weren't just for food. The Vikings were masters of practical botany, growing plants for every conceivable need. They cultivated flax in their infields not to eat, but to spin into linen cloth. The process was labor-intensive, soaking the stalks, breaking them, scutching and spinning the fibers, but the result was strong, durable fabric for clothing and sails. Imagine the sail on a Viking longship, that iconic engine of exploration. It wasn't made of wool or leather. It was almost certainly woven from linen, a product of the farm. Similarly, they grew hemp, an incredibly strong fiber used to make rope and cordage. The rigging that held the mast of a dragon ship, the ropes used to secure cargo, even the fishing nets, all of it likely started its life as a plant cultivated in the ton. So the next time you picture a Viking ship, remember, its very ability to move came from the field, not the forest. The farm provided not just the food for the journey, but the very fabric of the adventure itself. Yet to harness the full potential of that precious ton, the Vikings relied on a tool so fundamental it became an extension of the farmer's own will, the ard. This was not the heavy, deep-cutting moldboard plow that would later revolutionize European agriculture by completely inverting the soil. The Viking ard, sometimes called a scratch plow, was a different kind of marvel altogether. Crafted primarily from a single, strong piece of wood, often ash or oak, its most crucial component was a sharp, pointed iron tip known as the share. This iron point was the only metal part of the entire assembly, a valuable piece of technology forged by the community's blacksmith and fitted to the wooden frame. The entire contraption was then hitched to a team of powerful oxen, the true engines of the Viking farm. So why this design? Why choose a tool that merely scratches the surface when other cultures were developing plows that dug deeper? The answer lies in the very earth the Vikings sought to cultivate. Across Scandinavia, the soil is often a thin layer over a brutal, unyielding bed of rock. A heavy moldboard plow, designed to slice deep and turn over thick, heavy clay soils, would have been a disaster. It would have snagged on countless hidden stones, shattered against bedrock, and quickly broken both the tool and the spirit of the farmer trying to use it. The ard, in its elegant simplicity, was the perfect adaptation. Its iron-tipped share was designed to do one thing and do it well: cut a narrow, shallow groove into the topsoil, just deep enough to deposit seeds below the surface where they were protected from birds and the elements. It didn't turn the earth, it kissed it. This gentle approach offered another brilliant advantage. In those fragile northern ecosystems, the most fertile layer of soil is often that thin, precious top layer. A moldboard plow, by inverting the soil, can bury this good earth and bring less fertile subsoil to the surface. The ard avoided this entirely. It preserved the soil structure, minimized erosion on often sloped terrain, and effectively mixed in the precious manure and compost they had so carefully spread without destroying the land's delicate balance. It was a sustainable technology, honed by centuries of observation and experience. The rhythmic, scratching passage of the ard, guided by the farmer and pulled by steady oxen, wasn't just preparing the ground for a single season's harvest. It was a careful, repeated gesture that ensured the land would remain productive for generations to come, a quiet testament to their profound understanding of their environment. But even the most perfectly designed plow and the most carefully managed fields would eventually fail if the land itself lost its vitality. This was the farmer's greatest and most constant fear: soil exhaustion. In an age without synthetic fertilizers, without laboratories to analyze nutrient deficiencies, the Vikings had to become master ecologists, developing a sophisticated, multifaceted system of soil renewal that was every bit as advanced as their shipbuilding. Their entire survival depended on their ability to give back to the earth as much as they took from it. The cornerstone of this system, the absolute lifeblood of the farm's fertility, was manure. This wasn't a casual or haphazard process. It was a meticulously managed operation that revolved around the rhythms of the longhouse itself. Remember those valuable cows, goats, and sheep that were sheltered inside the building during the winter. Their presence served a dual purpose. Beyond providing warmth, they were essentially fertility factories, confined in one place where their waste could be efficiently collected. Throughout the long winter months, this dung, mixed with the straw and turf used for bedding, would accumulate into a rich, composting mixture. Come spring, this black gold was not wasted. It was carefully hauled out and spread across the precious in-field, directly replenishing the nitrogen and other essential nutrients that the previous year's crops had consumed. This practice of indoor winter stalling, or bow housing, was a brilliant strategy. It concentrated the fertilizer exactly where it was needed most and protected the animals from the harsh elements, ensuring they survived to produce more manure and more calves the following year. The health of the livestock and the fertility of the soil were two sides of the same coin. Yet the Vikings were far too pragmatic to rely on a single method. Their approach to fertilization was a testament to their ingenuity and their deep understanding of their local environment. Along the coastlines, they gathered great loads of seaweed, or tang, which they would cart up from the shore and spread on their fields. This marine resource was a fantastic soil amendment, rich in potash, trace minerals, and organic matter that helped to lighten heavy soils and improve moisture retention. In areas with peat bogs, they cut slabs of peat. While often used for fuel, peat also found its way onto fields as a mulch, helping to suppress weeds and slowly release acids and organic material into the ground. And nothing was wasted, not even fire. The ash from the longhouse hearth, from burnt wood and vegetation, was another valuable resource. Wood ash is highly alkaline and rich in potassium and calcium, making it perfect for counteracting the natural acidity of many Scandinavian soils and providing a direct nutrient boost to crops like barley. This wasn't a single solution but a repertoire of techniques, a toolkit for soil health. A farmer might use manure as his primary fertilizer, but supplement it with seaweed if he lived near the coast, or add ash to a specific patch of soil that needed an extra kick. They were reading the land, responding to its needs with the resources they had at hand. This constant, conscious effort to feed the soil ensured that the same ton could remain productive for generations, sometimes even centuries. It represents a profound, sustainable partnership with the land, a cycle of reciprocity where every resource was valued and nothing was taken for granted. The true harvest was not just the barley they reaped in autumn, but the continued fertility they guaranteed for the springs yet to come. And while the success of the harvest was measured in bushels of barley and stacks of hay, the true measure of a family's prosperity, their security, and their status in the community was not stored in a barn, it was breathing. In the Viking world, wealth was quite literally on the hoof. The livestock sheltered in the longhouse were not just animals, they were a living, walking bank account, a four-legged insurance policy, and the very engine of the farm itself. Their value was multifaceted and absolutely indispensable, making animal husbandry every bit as critical as the cultivation of crops. The most prestigious of all these animals was undoubtedly cattle. A sturdy, healthy cow was the cornerstone of a prosperous homestead. Its primary contribution was milk, a daily source of essential fat and protein that could be consumed fresh, turned into skyr, a yogurt-like curd, or, most importantly, crafted into cheese and butter, which were vital for preserving these nutrients through the winter. But a cow's value didn't end there. After its milking days were over, it provided meat and an incredibly tough hide that could be made into leather for shoes, belts, and armor. And perhaps most crucially, a team of oxen-castrated male cattle provided the immense pulling power needed to drag the yard through the rocky soil. Without that brute force, the field could not be plowed, and the entire agricultural cycle would grind to a halt. Owning a large, healthy herd of cattle was the ultimate sign of a powerful and successful family. Right alongside cattle in importance were sheep. These hardy animals were the walking wool factories of the Viking Age. Their fleece was sheared each year and then spun and woven into the woolen cloth that was the basis for virtually all Norse clothing, from the everyday tunics and dresses of farmers to the fine, colorful garments of the elite. A single sheep could provide enough wool to clothe a family member, and a large flock could generate a significant surplus for trade. Like cattle, sheep also provided milk for cheese making, and ultimately, meat and skins. Their ability to thrive on the rough grazing of the outfield made them incredibly efficient, converting poor forage into incredibly valuable textiles. For families who couldn't support a large cow, the goat was the perfect alternative. These agile and often stubborn animals were the unsung heroes of smaller farms or more marginal landscapes. They are browsers, able to thrive on shrubs, leaves, and rough vegetation that cattle and sheep would refuse, making them incredibly resilient. A good milking goat could provide a family with a steady supply of milk, and their hides were also valuable. They were the ultimate utility animal, offering a pathway to self-sufficiency for those without vast pastures. Then there were the providers of pure protein, pigs and poultry. Pigs were the ultimate recyclers, often left to forage in the forests surrounding the farmstead, where they would fatten up on acorns, roots, and whatever else they could find. This required very little investment from the farmer, but yielded a tremendous return in the form of smoked hams, bacon, and sausages, rich, calorie-dense meats that were essential for surviving the winter. In the farmyard, chickens, geese, and ducks provided a steady supply of eggs, a versatile and precious source of food. They also, of course, supplied meat and feathers, which were used for bedding and stuffing quilts. The collective value of these animals defined a family's place in the world. When a Viking said they were wealthy, they weren't talking about a chest of silver coins buried under the floorboards, though that certainly helped. They were talking about the size and health of their herd. A large byre full of lowing cattle and a pen crowded with sheep represented security. It meant the family could plow more land, produce more food and clothing, and withstand a poor harvest or a harsh winter. This wealth was visible to everyone. It was a daily, living display of status and stability that everyone in the community understood. The care and management of these animals, therefore, was not a simple chore. It was the most important responsibility on the farm, the diligent protection of the family's entire future. The rhythm of life on a Viking farm was a powerful, unending dance with the seasons, a cycle so deeply ingrained that it shaped every single day, every thought, and every hope for the future. This was not a calendar of dates, but a lived experience of light, weather, and survival. Let's walk through that year, from the first hopeful thaw to the deep, reflective snows of winter. Our year begins not on a random day in January, but with the first true signs of spring, a softening in the air, the retreat of the snowpack, and the lengthening of the days. This was the time of summer finding, a term that evokes not just a season, but a sense of rediscovery and urgent activity. The most critical task, the one that set the entire growing season in motion, was the first plowing. The farmer would lead his prized team of oxen out to the precious, enclosed tun. He would fit the wooden ard with its sharp iron share, and together, man and beast would begin the slow, deliberate work of cutting grooves into the earth that had lain frozen and fallow for months. This was a moment of immense ceremony and anxiety. The success of this plowing, the straightness of the furrows, the depth of the seedbed, it all dictated the potential of the harvest to come. As the ard scratched its lines across the field, other family members would follow behind, carefully sowing the precious saved seed barley, oats, rye into the waiting soil, trusting the earth and the returning sun to work their magic. As spring deepened into the long, luminous days of summer, the farm's focus underwent a subtle but crucial shift. The grains were growing, but they required less constant attention. Now, the entire community turned its energy to the single most important summer task: haymaking. This might sound like a simple chore, but for the Vikings, it was a matter of life and death. The hay harvested in summer was the sole winter food supply for the livestock, the cattle, sheep, and goats that represented the family's wealth and survival. Without enough hay, the animals would starve in their winter stalls, and with them, the family's source of milk, meat, leather, and traction power would perish. The process was a race against the weather. Men, women, and children would move out to the outfield, the rougher grazing lands, armed with iron-bladed scythes and sickles. They would cut the grass in great swaths, then turn it and spread it out to dry in the sun for several days. This was a nervous time. A sudden summer rain could ruin the entire crop, causing it to rot or mold. Once perfectly dry, the hay was gathered into stacks or hauled back to the farmstead to be stored in barns or lofts, built specifically to protect this vital winter fodder. The success of the hay harvest was arguably more anxiously watched than the grain harvest. A poor grain yield meant a hungry winter for people, but a failed hay crop meant catastrophe for everyone, human and animal alike. Then came autumn, the season of fulfillment and frantic preparation. The air turned crisp, and the landscape erupted in a final burst of golden color. This was the time of the main harvest. Using small iron sickles, the entire community would move into the tun to reap the stalks of barley, oats, and rye. This was back-breaking work, done stalk by stalk, handful by handful. The cut grain was gathered into sheaves and left to dry in the field on stooks, looking like rows of little teepees, before being threshed to separate the precious kernels from the husks. Concurrently, another critical autumn task was underway: the rounding up of livestock. All summer, many of the animals had been left to graze freely in the outfields and even in the surrounding forests. Now they had to be gathered back to the home farm. This was a time of counting, of assessing which animals had thrived and which might be culled for winter meat. The herds were driven back to the safety of the farmstead, their summer freedom over. Finally, the world closed in with the arrival of the winter nights. The first lasting snows fell, the seas froze, and the farm entered a state of near hibernation. The rhythm of life moved entirely indoors, into the smoky, warm, animal-scented world of the longhouse. The harvest was in, the stores were sealed, and the success or failure of the year's labor was now a fixed reality. This was the season of quiet, indoor craftsmanship. By the dim light of the central hearth fire, tools were repaired. Wood was carved into new handles for scythes, or into bowls and spoons. Wool from the gathered sheep was spun into yarn on drop spindles, and then woven into cloth on upright looms, the rhythmic clacking of the loom, a constant winter sound. But the primary focus, the daily, unending responsibility, was the care of the animals sheltered in the longhouse. They had to be fed with the hay so laboriously gathered months before, watered, and kept clean. Their health was paramount. The close quarters meant disease could spread quickly, so vigilance was constant. The winter was a time of stories, of law-making, of planning for the next spring. But above all, it was a long, watchful vigil, a test of endurance where the family lived directly off the bounty they had worked so desperately hard to secure during those fleeting, sun-drenched months of summer. This deep, generational connection to a specific patch of earth brings us to one of the most fascinating and powerful concepts in the Viking world: the idea of land ownership itself. For us today, land is often a commodity, something to be bought and sold. But for a Viking, the relationship was profoundly different, rooted in bloodline, honor, and a sacred right known as the odel. This wasn't just a law, it was the very bedrock of their identity and social structure. To understand the odel, we must first let go of our modern notion of property. The odel referred to land that was considered the inalienable, allodial property of a family. This was land that was owned outright, free from any superior landlord or feudal obligation. It was land that had been cleared, improved, and held by the same family for generations. This created an unbreakable bond between the clan and the soil. The owner of an odel farm wasn't just a landowner. He was the current guardian of his family's legacy, the inheritor of the sweat and toil of his ancestors. This came with immense pride and social status. To be an odelsbond, a freeholder of an ancestral farm, meant you answered to no one but the law of the land itself. Your authority on your own property was absolute. This fierce independence is a key part of the Viking spirit we so often romanticize. That desire for freedom and self-determination was literally rooted in the soil they called their own. But not every farmer enjoyed this privileged status. Alongside these allodial odel farms existed a different kind of arrangement. Land leased from a local chieftain or a more powerful lord. A farmer on leased land, known as a leglending, lived a very different reality. He might work a plot just as large and productive as his neighbor's odel farm, but his position was far less secure. He owed rent to his landlord, often paid in a portion of his harvest, valuable goods like butter or cloth, or even military service. His tenure was conditional. While customs offered some protection, a leglending could never know the same deep-seated security as an odelsbond. His fortunes were tied to the will of another, a constant reminder of his lower standing within the complex hierarchy of Norse society. This distinction between the independent landowner and the tenant farmer was a fundamental social divider. This system of inheritance, for all its strengths, contained the seeds of its own challenge, a pressure that would ultimately fuel the very expansion we remember them for. The standard practice was partible inheritance, meaning a family's land was divided equally among all its sons. At first glance, this seems fair, but over several generations, this tradition could have a dramatic, fragmenting effect. Imagine a prosperous 100-acre odel farm owned by a man with 3 sons. Upon his death, the land is split 3 ways. Each son now has a viable, if smaller, holding. But if each of those 3 sons then has 3 sons of their own, the original farm is now divided into 9 separate plots. Within a few generations, what was once a single, wealthy estate could become a patchwork of small, economically marginal parcels. A son might inherit a strip of land too narrow to plow effectively with a team of oxen, or a plot too small to yield enough hay to feed even a single cow through the winter. For the eldest son, who often received the central farmstead and the family longhouse, the situation might be manageable, but for younger sons, this inheritance system could be a sentence to a life of diminished status and hardship. They were left with a fragment of the family's former glory, a plot of land that could barely support a family. This created a powerful, relentless social pressure. A young man facing a future on an unviable sliver of his father's farm had a choice: resign himself to a life of struggle and potential poverty, or look outward for opportunity. And when he looked outward, his gaze would naturally fall on the horizon, on the sea lanes he'd heard about in stories, on the tales of distant lands with wide, empty valleys and rivers rich with fish. The need for land, the very same drive that tied his family to their odel for generations, could now push him to leave it all behind. The search for a place to establish his own name, to found his own odel that he could pass down to his sons, became a primary engine driving Viking exploration and settlement. The same cultural value that created such deep roots at home also compelled the ambitious and the dispossessed to sail into the unknown, not merely for silver, but for soil. While the Ard was the undisputed king of the spring fields, it was just one player in a full symphony of tools, each one a masterpiece of practical design, honed by generations of experience to perform a specific, vital task. The Viking farm was a workshop of wood and iron, and to understand their daily life is to hold these tools in your hands, to feel their weight and appreciate their purpose. After the Ard had done its work and the sun had nurtured the crops to maturity, the most critical tool of the year made its appearance: the sickle. This wasn't the large, curved blade we might picture from later medieval times. The Viking sickle was a smaller, more intimate tool, with a short iron blade that was either slightly curved or almost hook-like, set into a sturdy wooden handle. Its design was for precision, not power. During the harvest, a farmer would move through the ton, not swinging wildly, but grasping a handful of barley stalks with one hand and using the sickle in the other to slice through them at the base with a sharp, pulling motion. It was slow, methodical, back-straining work. Every single stalk of grain, the very source of life for the coming winter, was cut by hand in this way. The sound of the harvest was not the hum of machinery, but the soft rustle of stalks and the steady, rhythmic snick of iron against stem. This careful, stalk-by-stalk approach minimized waste, ensuring that every precious kernel was gathered. The success of the entire growing season culminated in the blistered hands and tired back of the reaper wielding this simple, indispensable iron blade. But the grain harvest was only one of the summer's great gatherings. The other, arguably more demanding task, required a completely different kind of tool, the scythe. Where the sickle was for delicate, precise cutting, the scythe was for raw, sweeping power. The Viking scythe had a long, slightly curved wooden shaft, the snath, with two hand grips that allowed the user to stand upright and put their whole body into a wide, swinging motion. Mounted to the end of this snath was a long, heavy iron blade, much larger and more formidable than the sickles. This was the tool for haymaking. Out in the outfield, men would line up and swing their scythes in unison, cutting great swaths of grass with each pass. This was a test of endurance and skill, a coordinated effort to conquer vast areas of grassland before the weather could turn. The scythe turned the monumental task of gathering winter fodder into something achievable. It converted human strength into efficient action, and the survival of the valuable livestock through the long winter depended entirely on the effectiveness of this tool and the hard labor behind it. For the countless other tasks that defined daily life, the most universal tool was undoubtedly the spade, but this was no simple garden trowel. The Viking spade was a serious piece of equipment, often shod with an iron blade or reinforced with an iron strip along its leading edge. This iron tip was crucial for piercing the tough, root-filled earth of a new plot or for cutting through the dense, matted layers of turf used to build and roof their longhouses. You'd see the spade in constant use, digging drainage ditches to keep the precious fields from flooding, turning the compost midden where all organic waste was recycled back into the soil, or excavating the ground for a new storage pit. It was the ultimate multi-purpose digger, a testament to the Viking belief that any problem, from construction to agriculture, could be solved with a sturdy wooden handle and a well-forged iron edge. Then there was the axe, the tool so iconic we immediately associate it with the Viking warrior. But on the farm, the axe had a far more peaceful and equally vital role. It existed in many forms, from the large, heavy broad axe used for hewing logs into planks for building ships and houses, to the smaller, more hand-friendly hand axe used for finer woodworking and countless daily chores. The axe was the key to land clearance. Before a field could ever be plowed, the forest had to be pushed back. This meant felling trees, a job for the heavy axe, and then splitting the timber for construction or firewood. It was used to shape the wooden components of the yard, to make handles for other tools, and to chop the firewood that heated the longhouse and cooked every meal. The axe was fundamental to creating the very world the Vikings lived in. It was the instrument of transformation, turning wild forest into managed farmland and raw timber into civilization. Finally, after the grain was harvested and safely stored, came the last step in the long journey from field to table, the quernstone. This was the family's bread factory, a simple but brutally effective device found in every single household. It consisted of two heavy, circular stones. The lower stone, the quern, sat stationary. The upper stone, the handstone, had a handle fixed to it and was rotated over the grain placed between them. This was almost exclusively women's work, and it was some of the most arduous labor on the farm. Grinding enough grain to make flour for a single day's bread could take hours of relentless, circular grinding. The grit from the stones wore down teeth over a lifetime, and the constant, repetitive motion took a toll on the body, but this daily grind was non-negotiable. It was the final, essential process that unlocked the nutrition within the hard barley kernels, turning them into the flour that would be baked into the dense, dark loaves that were the true staff of life. The low, rhythmic rumble of the quernstone was the sound of survival, a daily reminder that every mouthful of food was earned through immense, sustained effort. Successfully bringing in the harvest from the fields was only half the battle won. The true test of a Viking family's skill and foresight was safeguarding that precious bounty through the long, dark winter. Every single kernel of grain, every root vegetable, every scrap of meat represented hours of backbreaking labor, and letting it spoil was simply not an option. Their entire survival strategy hinged on a sophisticated understanding of preservation, using a combination of ingenious storage structures and time-tested techniques to outlast the harsh season. For their most vital crop grain, keeping it perfectly dry was the absolute priority. Dampness meant mold, rot, and the terrifying prospect of ergotism, a fungal poisoning that could cause convulsions and death. To prevent this, they built specialized above-ground storage houses, often raised slightly on stilts or stone foundations to protect the contents from ground moisture and pests. These structures were designed with ventilation in mind, allowing air to circulate constantly around the stored sheaves of barley or rye, keeping them dry and safe until they were needed for daily grinding at the cornstone. This careful, dedicated storage ensured the family's bread and porridge would last until the next summer's harvest. But perhaps their most fascinating solution for a variety of goods was going underground. Across the Viking world, archaeologists frequently find evidence of what are known as Grubenhäuser German for pit houses. While some of these were indeed simple sunken floor dwellings or workshops, a significant number served a far more critical purpose. They were natural refrigerators. A deep storage pit, dug into the cool, consistent temperature of the earth, provided the perfect environment for preserving certain foods. The bottom of these pits would often be lined with straw or clay, and then filled with root vegetables like turnips or cabbages, which could be buried in sand to extend their freshness for months. The stable, cool temperature of the subterranean earth prevented freezing in early winter and slowed spoilage, creating a simple yet highly effective larder that required no technology beyond a strong spade and smart planning. While grains and vegetables could be stored relatively passively, preserving the protein from their livestock required a much more active and transformative process. When an animal was slaughtered in the autumn, a necessary step to reduce the number of mouths to feed over winter, every single part of the creature was used, and the meat itself had to be treated to prevent it from rotting within days. They became masters of three fundamental preservation methods: drying, smoking, and salting. Drying, or air drying, was one of the simplest and most common techniques. Strips of meat or entire sides of mutton and beef would be hung high in the rafters of the longhouse, where the constant, warm, smoky air from the central hearth would slowly dehydrate them. This process drew out the moisture that bacteria need to thrive, creating a hard, durable product similar to modern-day jerky that could be stored for months and then boiled in a stew to reconstitute it. Smoking was a closely related but more intensified process. Meats, and especially fish, would be hung inside a dedicated smokehouse or in the upper, smokier parts of the longhouse, above a fire fed with specific types of wood. The smoke itself acted as a powerful antimicrobial agent, coating the meat and further protecting it from spoilage while imparting a rich, savory flavor that defined the Viking winter diet. The most valuable preservation agent, however, was salt. While not as readily available in Scandinavia as in warmer climates, the Vikings obtained salt by boiling seawater in large pots or trading for it. Salting meat involved packing it in layers with coarse salt, which aggressively pulled out moisture and created an environment too hostile for most bacteria to survive. This produced a product that could last for an exceptionally long time. Highly prized cuts of meat, preserved this way, were a sign of true wealth and careful management. And then there was butter, a staple source of fat that they discovered could be preserved for astonishing lengths of time. They would pack fresh butter tightly into wooden barrels or boxes, sometimes first boiling it to clarify it and remove impurities. They then buried these containers in the cool, oxygen-poor environment of a peat bog. The cold, consistent temperature, the acidic pH of the bog, and the lack of air created a near-perfect sealing effect. Archaeologists have occasionally unearthed these bog butter barrels, with the contents inside, while rancid, still recognizably butter after more than 1,000 years. This wasn't just food storage, it was a form of time travel, a way to save the rich abundance of the summers grazing for a desperate moment deep in the heart of winter. Each of these methods, from the smoky rafters to the cool, dark pits, reveals a people who were not just fierce warriors, but pragmatic, brilliant conservators of life, meticulously planning for the future one carefully stored barrel at a time. Yet behind every successful harvest, every well-stocked storage pit, and every thriving longhouse, there was a force even more vital than the sharpest iron tool or the strongest ox, the woman of the farm. To only picture Viking men, whether as farmers or warriors, is to miss half of the story, and arguably the more important half for daily survival. While the sagas sing of legendary explorers and fierce raiders, the silent, steady backbone of the entire Viking Age was its women, who were not merely helpers but were most often the chief executives, the head engineers, and the relentless managers of the agricultural world. Consider the reality of the time. Even in a peaceful year, men might be away for weeks or months on long-distance fishing trips, engaged in local disputes, or attending the regional parliament, the thing. And if a ship was launched for trade or raiding, the most able-bodied men could be gone for a year or more. In their absence, the entire immense responsibility of the farm, the very survival of the family, the animals, and the legacy of the odal fell squarely on the shoulders of the woman. She held the keys, both literal and figurative, to everything. She wasn't just keeping the home fires burning. She was running a sophisticated, multi-faceted agricultural business that required expert knowledge in animal husbandry, food science, resource management, and human labor. Her domain began the moment she stepped outside the longhouse. She was the overseer of the livestock, knowing each animal by name and condition, deciding which ones needed extra feed, which were ready for breeding, and which might need to be culled when winter approaches. The dairy production was almost exclusively her realm, a daily ritual of immense importance. Each morning and evening, she would milk the cows, goats, and sheep. This milk was then transformed through her skill into the stable calories that would see the family through the year. She cultured it into skyr, a thick, protein-rich yogurt-like food that is still a staple in Iceland today. She expertly separated cream to churn into butter, a precious source of fat that could be preserved in boggy larders, and she crafted countless wheels of cheese, a process requiring precise temperatures, pressing, and aging. This wasn't simple cooking. It was a form of biochemical engineering, using knowledge passed down from mother to daughter for generations. Inside the longhouse, her command was absolute. She directed the complex workflow of textile production, the other pillar of the Norse economy. It was she who organized the carding of wool, the spinning of yarn on drop spindles, and the weaving of vast lengths of cloth on heavy upright looms. The clothes on every family member's back, the sails on the ships, the blankets on the beds, all were created under her supervision. She managed the food stores with a meticulous eye, knowing exactly how much grain, dried meat, and preserved butter remained and how it needed to be rationed to last until spring. She was also, very often, the manager of human resources. On a larger farm, this meant directing the work of thralls, slaves captured or traded from foreign lands, assigning them daily tasks in the fields, with the animals, or at the quernstones. The archaeological record offers powerful proof of this authority. In numerous grave sites, women are buried with a stunning symbol of this responsibility, a large iron-ringed key, often worn prominently on a chain at her belt. This was no small key for a chest. This was the key to the family's food storage barns, to the pantries where the winter supplies were kept under lock and key. To be buried with this key was to be buried with a badge of office, a clear signal to the community and to the afterlife that this was a woman of substance, a manager, a guardian of her family's survival. Her value was not in her ability to wield a sword, but in her unparalleled ability to wield knowledge, foresight, and command over the complex ecosystem of the farm. While a man might leave to seek fame and fortune, it was the woman who ensured there was a prosperous and stable home to return to, making her the true, unsung chieftain of the Viking world. But for all the ingenuity and hard work of the free Viking family, there was another, darker layer to this agricultural society. A silent and largely unrecorded workforce that formed the true foundation of the largest and most prosperous estates. To truly understand the Viking economic engine, we must confront the uncomfortable and often glossed over reality of the thrall. Slavery was not a peripheral aspect of Norse society. It was utterly integral to it, a brutal fact of life that provided the manual muscle which made expansive farming and wealth accumulation possible. The term thrall itself carries a weight that goes beyond our modern word slave. It evoked a state of complete subjugation, a person stripped of rights, honor, and kinship, the very things that gave a free Viking their identity. Thralls were considered property, little more than talking livestock, to be bought, sold, traded, or willed to an heir. Their value was calculated in silver, much like a prized cow or a good sword, and their lives were defined by relentless, unending labor. On a large, successful farm, it was the thralls who performed the most back-breaking, monotonous, and undesirable tasks, freeing the freeborn family to manage, oversee, and engage in more skilled work. So how did one become a thrall? The pathways into this wretched existence were several. The most common source was through capture during those infamous Viking raids abroad. A successful raid wasn't just about grabbing silver and treasure. Human capital was often the most valuable and lasting prize. A young man or woman captured in Ireland, Scotland, or the Slavic lands could be marched in chains back to the ships and transported to a foreign land, their old life obliterated, to be sold at a market. But you didn't have to be captured overseas to become a thrall. Vikings also enslaved other Scandinavians, often as a result of debt. A free man who fell into insurmountable debt could be forced to sell himself or his children into thraldom to settle what he owed. And finally, the condition was heritable. A child born to an enslaved mother was automatically a thrall themselves, their fate sealed from birth, ensuring a self-replenishing source of labor for the owning family. The work assigned to thralls was the absolute bedrock of the farm's operation, the gritty, physical toil that kept the entire system running. Imagine the sheer effort required to clear new land for planting. This wasn't just about cutting down trees, it was about wrestling with an ancient, stony landscape. Thralls would be the ones swinging the heavy iron axes to fell trees and then, most gruelingly, digging out countless stones and boulders from the soil by hand, their hands torn and bleeding, to create a workable field. They would move these stones to the edges to build the very walls that enclosed the precious ton they had just created. Once the fields were established, the thralls' work became cyclical and equally demanding. They would be the ones following the oxen, guiding the art across the rocky soil under the watchful eye of the foreman. They would be the ones bent double during the harvest, swinging the sickle for hours on end under the summer sun. When the hay was cut, they would be the ones turning it, gathering it, and hauling the heavy loads back to the farmstead. And they would be responsible for the most pungent, essential task of all, mucking out the animal stalls inside the longhouse during the winter. This meant shoveling the accumulated manure and wet straw, the very substance that was the farm's fertility, and carting it out to be composted. This was filthy, difficult, and never-ending work. Inside the longhouse, female thralls faced their own relentless grind. They would be the ones spending hours every day at the cornstone, grinding grain into flour until their arms and backs ached. They would be assigned the daily milking of the cows and goats, and the labor-intensive processing of that milk into skyr, butter, and cheese. They would card wool, spin yarn, and weave cloth under the direction of the mistress of the house, producing the textiles that were a primary form of wealth. Their lives were a constant cycle of labor with little hope of reprieve or reward. The presence of thralls created a stark social hierarchy. A large number of thralls was the ultimate status symbol, a clear, visible sign of a family's power and prosperity. It meant they did not have to submit their own children to the most degrading toil. This economic engine, powered by forced labor, allowed the wealthy elite to amass even greater surpluses, more hay to feed more livestock, more barley to brew more beer, more wool to produce more cloth for trade. This wealth could then be used to buy better weapons, build finer ships, and attract more followers, further increasing their power and prestige. The iconic image of the Viking adventurer, setting sail for glory, was often built upon the silent, suffering backs of the thralls they left behind to maintain the homestead that funded their dreams. Yet while the protected tun was the agricultural heart of the farm, feeding the family was only one part of a much larger and more complex relationship with the land. Just beyond that sturdy stone fence lay a vast and vital expanse known as the outfield. This was the wilder, rougher cousin to the carefully managed infield, a place where control gave way to adaptation, and where the rhythm of life was dictated by the seasons in a much more primal way. The outfield wasn't enclosed or fertilized with the same obsessive care. Its soil was often thinner, more acidic, and littered with the stones that had been patiently cleared from the home field over generations. This land wasn't meant for intensive cropping. It served two critical, broader purposes that were just as essential to survival. During the precious summer months, the outfield became the primary pasture for the farm's livestock. This was where the valuable cattle, sheep, and goats were sent to graze after the spring planting was complete. They would roam these rougher lands, converting the tough native grasses, heather, and shrubs into the milk, meat, and wool that sustained the family. This practice was brilliantly efficient. It allowed the nutritious grasses within the protected tun to grow tall and be harvested as winter hay, while the animals fended for themselves on land that was otherwise less productive. But the outfield's role didn't end with grazing. On slightly better patches of soil, especially those that had been rested from animals for a season or two, the Vikings practiced a form of intermittent cultivation known as outfield agriculture. They might scatter some hardy rye or oats in a cleared area, harvest a modest crop, and then let the land revert to pasture for several years. Recover. This shifting, low-intensity farming was a smart way to squeeze extra calories from the landscape without depleting its fragile fertility. This distinction between the infield and outfield reveals a brilliant two-tiered strategy for managing risk. The infield was the guaranteed food supply, the non-negotiable core that was protected and nurtured at all costs. The outfield was the flexible frontier, a buffer zone that provided essential resources, grazing, and occasional extra grain, while absorbing the uncertainties of weather and soil quality. A poor yield in the outfield was disappointing, but a failure within the tun was a catastrophe. This layered approach to land use allowed Viking farms to be both highly productive and remarkably resilient. But the Viking farmer's world extended even beyond his own outfield. Woven into the very fabric of their society was the concept of the commons lands that were not owned by any single family, but were shared by the entire community. These common lands were the true lungs of the Viking world, encompassing vast tracts of forest, mountain meadows, peat bogs, and shoreline. Access to these shared resources was not a luxury. It was a fundamental right, a crucial part of the economic foundation that allowed individual farms to thrive. The commons provided a safety net and a reservoir of raw materials that no single household could ever hope to own or manage on its own. The most important of these shared resources were the common pastures. During the summer, it was customary for the entire community to pool their livestock, everyone's cattle, sheep, goats, and even geese into a single large herd. This collective herd would then be driven up into the high mountain pastures, known in Old Norse as the sel or cedar, to graze under the watchful eye of a community-appointed herder, often a young man or woman from one of the farms. This practice, called transhumance, was a stroke of genius. It allowed the precious, fertilized grasses of the home fields down in the valley to grow untouched for the vital hay harvest, while the animals benefited from the rich, fresh grazing available in the highlands. It prevented overgrazing around the homestead and fostered a powerful sense of communal cooperation. The entire village had a shared interest in the health and safety of that collective herd. The forests of the commons were another indispensable treasure. Within these woods, every free farmer had the right to collect fallen timber for firewood, to cut specific trees for building repairs or for crafting new tools, and to gather peat from the bogs to fuel the longhouse fire. The forest provided the raw materials for nearly everything: the handle for a new scythe, the planks for a boat, the roof beams for a barn. It was a hardware store, a fuel depot, and a construction yard all rolled into one. Furthermore, the commons offered a vital supplementary food source through foraging. Families would venture into the shared woodlands to harvest nature's bounty: sweet wild berries like blueberries and lingonberries, which could be dried or preserved, nutritious hazelnuts, and a wide variety of mushrooms, which added crucial flavor and variety to a winter diet often dominated by stored grains and salted meat. These foraged foods were not just treats. They were essential vitamins and nutrients that helped stave off deficiency and disease during the long, dark months. This system of common land was so vital that its rules and boundaries were fiercely protected by law. Disputes over grazing rights or illegal tree cutting could be brought before the local thing, the Viking assembly, and were treated with the utmost seriousness. The commons ensured that even the poorest free farmer, who might only own a small strip of odal land, could still access the resources needed to keep a goat, feed his family, and maintain his status as an independent man. It was a powerful check against total inequality, and a testament to a society that understood its collective survival depended on a shared stewardship of the wider landscape. The strength of the individual farm was inextricably linked to the health of the common land that surrounded it. Of all the crops cultivated across the Viking world, the single most important harvest, the one upon which every other aspect of their survival hinged, was not grain for bread or flax for linen, but something far more humble: hay. This might seem surprising. We don't often think of dried grass as the foundation of an empire, but in the unforgiving climate of the North, the success of the annual hay harvest was nothing less than the difference between prosperity and catastrophe, between life and death for the entire community. A bountiful hay crop meant security. A failed one spelled a slow, grim disaster that no amount of silver or plunder could avert. The reason for this supreme importance lay in the value of the livestock themselves. As we've seen, cattle, sheep, and goats were the true measure of a family's wealth, their four-legged fortune. But these animals could not graze through a Scandinavian winter. For 5, 6, sometimes 7 months, the land was locked in ice and buried under deep snow. During this long season of darkness, the entire herd had to be sheltered inside or adjacent to the longhouse, and they required a massive amount of stored food to survive until the spring thaw. The sole source of that winter feed was the hay cut and dried during the fleeting weeks of summer. The equation was brutally simple. The amount of hay safely stored in the barn by autumn directly dictated how many animals could be kept alive through the winter. A farmer could have 100 head of cattle, but if he only had enough hay to feed 20, he faced a terrible choice: slaughter 80 of them in the autumn, losing their future milk, calves, and labor, or watch all 100 slowly starve to death as the hay stores ran out midwinter. The hay harvest was the linchpin in this entire delicate system of survival. This made the haymaking season a period of intense, community-wide anxiety and backbreaking labor. It was a race against the weather, a frantic sprint to capture the sun's energy in the form of grass before the seasons turned. The process began in the outfields and common pastures, where the grasses had grown tall and lush under the midnight sun. Men would go out in lines, swinging their long-shafted scythes in a wide, rhythmic motion, cutting great swaths of grass with each powerful swing. This was skilled, exhausting work that required strength and stamina, as a sharp, well-maintained iron blade was crucial for efficiency. Behind the mowers, the rest of the family, women, children, and thralls, would follow, spreading the cut grass out to dry. They used long wooden rakes to turn it periodically, ensuring every blade was exposed to the sun and wind. This drying phase was the most nerve-wracking part of the entire operation. The cut grass had to lose most of its moisture to prevent it from rotting or developing toxic molds once stored. This required several days of clear, dry weather. A sudden summer rainstorm could be devastating, spoiling an entire field's worth of labor in a matter of hours. The grass would have to be turned and returned, desperately trying to save it, but a prolonged wet spell could ruin the crop entirely. turning the precious hay into a black, slimy, useless mess. The entire community watched the sky, their fortunes literally hanging on the weather. Once perfectly dry and brittle, the hay was gathered. It was often twisted into large bundles or loaded onto simple wooden sleds or carts to be hauled back to the farmstead. There it was stored with immense care, packed tightly into dedicated hay barns or stacked in lofty storage areas within the main buildings. These storage spaces were designed for maximum protection, raised off the damp ground and often lined with wood to keep the hay dry and safe from pests. A well-built hay barn, packed to the rafters, was a more comforting sight to a Viking farmer than a chest of silver. It was the guarantee of spring, the assurance that his wealth on the hoof would still be there to greet the returning sun. The consequences of a bad hay year were therefore apocalyptic for a farm. It meant not just the loss of animals, but the collapse of the entire economic and nutritional system. No animals meant no milk, no cheese, no butter, the essential fats and proteins gone from the diet. It meant no oxen to pull the plow come spring, making it impossible to plant the next year's grain crop. It meant no new calves or lambs to rebuild the devastated herd. It meant no wool to make clothes or sails. A single failed hay harvest could plunge a prosperous family into a debt spiral or outright poverty from which it might take a generation to recover. This constant looming threat explains the almost sacred importance placed on haymaking. It was the most critical, most stressful, and most vital task of the entire Viking year, the quiet, unsung labor that truly powered the age. Beyond the expansive fields of barley and the vital hay meadows, nestled close to the warmth and protection of the longhouse itself, lay a more intimate and flavorful corner of the Viking world, the kitchen garden. While the large-scale cultivation of grains was the engine of caloric survival, these smaller, carefully tended plots were the heart of culinary life, adding not just nutrition, but also flavor, variety, and medicine to the daily diet. The Vikings were not just subsistence farmers, they were discerning horticulturists who valued a diverse and flavorful table. Archaeological evidence, particularly from sites like Viborg and Odense in Denmark, provides us with a vivid picture of these gardens. Through the painstaking analysis of soil samples and the recovery of carbonized seeds, we know the Viking palate was far more sophisticated than a simple diet of bread and meat. Their gardens were a vibrant tapestry of vegetables, each chosen for its hardiness and utility. They cultivated cabbages, a versatile staple that could be stored for months in cool pits or fermented into a primitive sauerkraut, providing vital vitamins through the winter. They grew protein-rich beans and peas, which could be dried and added to thick stews and porridges. And no kitchen garden would be complete without alliums. They grew both onions and their milder cousin, the leek, which added a crucial depth of flavor to otherwise bland meals and were also valued for their perceived medicinal properties. But a Viking cook's repertoire extended far beyond basic vegetables. These gardens were also a pharmacy and a spice cabinet. They deliberately cultivated a range of herbs that speak to a complex understanding of flavor and wellness. Dill was a particular favorite. Its feathery fronds and seeds used to season fish, preserve meat, and aid digestion. Coriander was grown not for its leaves, as we might use cilantro today, but for its seeds, which were crushed to add a citrusy, aromatic note to food and drink. Perhaps most importantly, they grew hops. While we associate hops primarily with beer today, the Vikings were using them for this purpose long before it became standard practice across Europe. Adding hops to their barley beer did more than just impart a characteristic bitterness. It acted as a natural preservative, allowing the beer to last longer and making it a more stable and reliable source of nutrition on long voyages or through the winter months. In the more forgiving climates of southern Scandinavia and in their settled lands across the North Sea, such as in the Danelaw of England, Viking horticulture reached its pinnacle with the cultivation of fruit trees. Orchards represented a true long-term investment in the land, a commitment to a future the planter might not even see, as apple and pear trees can take many years to mature and bear fruit. This practice shows a shift from a purely survivalist mindset to one of established prosperity and permanence. The apple was the undisputed king of the Viking orchard. These weren't the large, perfectly sweet varieties we know today, but smaller, tougher crabapples and sour cooking apples. Their tartness made them perfect for baking into skyr-based desserts, pressing into cider, or most commonly, slicing and drying into rings that could be stored for years. These chewy, tangy apple rings were a treasured treat, a burst of summer sweetness in the depths of winter, and a valuable trade item. A successful orchard was the ultimate symbol that a Viking family wasn't just surviving on a new shore. They were truly putting down roots, cultivating a sweet and lasting legacy for generations to come. While the ingenuity of Viking farmers was truly remarkable, their success was not solely a product of human will and clever tools. They had a powerful, silent partner in their endeavors, the very climate of the era. The Viking Age did not unfold in a vacuum. It was catalyzed by a significant shift in global weather patterns known today as the medieval warm period, or what many historians specifically call the Viking climatic optimum. This was not a minor fluctuation, but a profound change that lasted for several centuries, roughly from the year 900 to 1250, perfectly framing the era of Norse expansion. Imagine the North Atlantic, not as the frigid, storm-ravaged expanse we often picture, but as a noticeably milder, more navigable sea. Glaciers retreated in the mountains, and average temperatures across Scandinavia and the North Atlantic rose by a degree or 2 Celsius. That might sound small, but in the delicate balance of northern agriculture, it made all the difference in the world. This warming had a direct and dramatic impact on the most fundamental resource for any farmer, the growing season. In Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, the frost-free period lengthened. Spring arrived a little earlier, and the first hard frosts of autumn held off a little longer. This granted those precious cereal crops, the barley, oats, and rye, extra weeks of sunshine to mature fully. A longer growing season drastically reduced the risk of a late spring frost killing young seedlings or an early autumn frost destroying a harvest before it could be gathered. This meant more reliable yields, fewer famines, and a consistent agricultural surplus year after year. For the first time, farms could reliably produce more food than was needed for mere survival. This surplus is the foundational fuel for any complex society. It means that not every single person has to be directly involved in food production. This abundance freed up labor and resources, allowing for specialization. It meant a family could afford to have a son train as a blacksmith or a shipbuilder instead of working the fields. And it meant there was excess grain to trade for the iron needed to tip those plowshares and weave those sails. Nowhere was the impact of this climatic bonus more starkly visible than on the frontiers of the Viking world, particularly in Iceland. Before the warm period, Iceland was a marginal, unforgiving land, perched on the very edge of the habitable world. Its short, cool summers and volatile weather made large-scale agriculture a tremendous gamble. But during the Viking climatic optimum, something extraordinary happened. The warming ocean currents made the voyage to Iceland less perilous, and once there, settlers found a land that was, for a time, surprisingly fertile. They discovered that barley, that most essential of Viking crops, could actually be cultivated successfully at latitudes that would have been unthinkable just a century before. Icelandic sagas and archaeological evidence both confirm that Norse settlers were able to grow barley in sheltered valleys across the island. This wasn't just about baking bread, it was about brewing beer, the caloric and social staple of their culture. The ability to grow grain in Iceland wasn't just a convenience. It was a declaration that this harsh new world could truly become a home. It meant a settlement could be self-sufficient, not entirely dependent on dangerous and expensive supply lines from the distant Norwegian homeland. This agricultural windfall, repeated across the Norse world, triggered a powerful biological and social consequence, a significant population boom. With more reliable food supplies, infant mortality rates likely decreased, and life expectancy increased. Families could support more children, and those children were more likely to survive to adulthood. Over just a few generations, the fjords and valleys of Scandinavia began to feel crowded. The same partible inheritance system that divided family farms now created a growing class of younger sons with ambition and energy, but without enough land to support their own families and aspirations. The population was expanding, but the amount of odal land was not. This created a powerful pressure valve, a generation of restless, land-hungry young people looking for their own legacy. And so, the stage was perfectly set. The climate had provided the means: longer seasons, bountiful harvests, and a surplus that could fund voyages. It had also demonstrated the possibility: if barley could grow in Iceland, what other lands might be waiting out there? And the population boom had provided the motive, a driving need for new territory. The silver and treasures of foreign monasteries might have been the glittering lure, but the true, deep foundation of the Viking expansion was an abundance of food and an abundance of people. The longships that set out from Scandinavian shores were not just filled with warriors, they were filled with farmers. They carried within their hulls the seeds of barley, the iron tips of ards, and the ingrained knowledge of how to work the land. They were seeking not just plunder, but soil. The warmth that had filled their storehouses back home now propelled them across the sea, allowing them to transplant their entire way of life onto the shores of Greenland, the islands of the North Atlantic, and eventually, the coast of a continent they could never have dreamed of. The Viking Age, in its essence, began not with a raid, but with a harvest. Yet for all their practical skill and deep understanding of the land, the Viking farmer knew that his own hard work and clever tools were only part of the equation. The success of a harvest, the health of a newborn calf, the very turning of the seasons, these were forces far beyond any human control. And so, woven into the very fabric of their daily toil was a profound and constant spiritual dimension. The Vikings did not see their world as a simple mechanistic system of cause and effect. They lived in a vibrant, animated universe where the divine was present in every rain shower, every sunbeam, and every sprouting seed. Their survival depended not just on their own labor, but on maintaining a sacred relationship with the gods who govern the forces of life and growth. Foremost among these divine patrons of the farm was the radiant god Freyr. He was no distant, warlike deity of Asgard, but a god deeply and intimately connected to the earth itself. Freyr was a Vanir god, a member of the older race of deities associated with fertility, wisdom, and the natural world. He was the lord of sunshine and rain, the ruler of peace and prosperity, and the ultimate guarantor of a bountiful harvest. His very essence was abundance. He was often depicted with an immense phallus, a powerful and direct symbol of his life-giving power, and his most prized possessions were not weapons, but magical tools of fertility. The ship Skithblathnir, which could fold to fit in a pocket but always found a fair wind, and the golden-bristled boar Gullinbursti, who could run through the air and over water, illuminating the darkness. Glowing mane, to a Viking farmer, a prayer to Freyr was as essential as sharpening the iron share of his ard. They looked to him for the timely rains that would nourish their barley, for the warmth that would ripen their crops, and for the vitality that would ensure their livestock bred successfully. A community that honored Freyr was a community that expected full storehouses and healthy herds. But divine favor was not assumed. It had to be earned and actively maintained through a reciprocal relationship. This exchange between the human and the divine was formalized in sacred rituals known as blots. A blot was not a quiet, personal prayer. It was a major communal event, a feast of sacrifice intended to strengthen the bonds of kinship within the community, and, most importantly, to honor the gods and secure their goodwill. While a blot could be held for many reasons before a voyage, to celebrate a victory, to honor the dead, the agricultural blots were among the most critical events of the year, timed to the turning points of the farming calendar. The most significant of these was undoubtedly the autumn blot, held around the time of the winter nights, to give thanks for the harvest and to petition the gods for protection and fertility through the coming darkness. The central act of the blot was the sacrifice itself, an offering of something precious to demonstrate devotion and to establish a cycle of gift-giving with the divine. The chosen offering was almost always an animal, a prized stallion, a strong ox, a healthy boar, or numerous goats. the selection of the animal was a serious matter. It had to be a fine specimen, a true representation of the wealth and health the community wished to maintain. The animal was then ceremonially slaughtered. Its blood, considered to hold the very essence of life, was collected in a sacred bowl. This blood, or H-laut, was not wasted. It was sprinkled on the altars of the temple, on the walls of the building, and even on the participants themselves, a powerful act of sanctification meant to spread the divine blessing throughout the community. The meat of the sacrificed animal was then boiled in large cauldrons, and the resulting feast was a sacred meal, shared by all. In eating this hallowed food, the community believed they were literally taking the gods' blessing into themselves, internalizing the strength and fertility they sought. Even the toast was ritualized. Horns of mead or beer were raised first to Odin for power and victory, then to Njord and Freyr for peace and a good harvest, and finally to the memory of departed kinsmen. Every aspect of the ritual, from the spill of blood to the shared meal, was designed to reaffirm the covenant between the people and the powers that govern their fragile existence. This spiritual connection to the land extended beyond the grand communal blots and into the very soil of the farmstead itself. The Vikings practiced a form of animism, believing that spirits, or landvitir, inhabited every rock, tree, and stream. These spirits were not gods, but local guardians of the land, and their favor was essential for a farm to thrive. A family would take great care not to offend these spirits through careless action. They might leave small offerings of food or ale at a distinctive stone or ancient tree believed to be a spirit's home. The concept of the fylgja, a protective spirit that followed a family lineage, was also often tied to the land's fertility. A happy, prosperous farm was seen as having strong and benevolent landvitir, while a farm plagued by poor harvests or sick animals might be thought to have angered its local spirits or been cursed. This belief created a powerful ethic of stewardship. The farmer wasn't just working for himself. He was a caretaker in a landscape alive with invisible, powerful presences. His success was a sign of their approval, a daily testament to a harmony that existed between his family, his animals, and the very soul of the land they called home. When those iconic longships landed on the distant, uncharted shores of Iceland, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands, they carried within their hulls more than just warriors and weapons. They carried an entire agricultural blueprint, a way of life meticulously honed over centuries in the Norwegian fjords. The settlers spilling onto these new beaches weren't just explorers. They were farmers, and their first task was not to conquer a people, but to conquer a landscape. They stepped ashore with the ingrained rhythms of the Scandinavian year pulsing in their minds, with the image of the protected tun and the grazing outfield as their model, and with the unwavering belief that their methods could force this new world to provide. But the lands they encountered were not simply empty copies of home. They were unique, fragile, and often brutally unforgiving ecosystems that would test their resilience to its absolute limit, forcing adaptation and, in some cases, leading to unintended catastrophe. The initial challenge was one of raw, practical assessment. In places like Iceland, the first sight must have been both awe-inspiring and deeply unsettling. Here were vast, empty valleys bordered by towering volcanoes, a land of stark black sand, steaming geothermal vents, and lush, untouched grasslands that had never felt the bite of an iron ard. The soil itself was different. In Scandinavia, much of the soil was glacial till, a mix of clay, sand, and stones they knew how to work. In Iceland, however, much of the ground was composed of volcanic tephra airy, wind-blown scoria that was incredibly susceptible to erosion. The settlers saw the lush grass and assumed incredible fertility, but they didn't yet understand that the thin skin of vegetation was all that held the delicate soil beneath it in place. Their first instinct, born of generations of practice, was to recreate the world they knew. They began the back-breaking work of land clearance, using their trusted iron axes to fell the forests of native birch that covered significant parts of the island. This wood was vital for building their longhouses, for fuel, and for crafting tools, but the scale of this deforestation was something entirely new and devastating. They applied their two-tiered system with relentless efficiency. They established their ton in the most promising valleys, enclosing the best land with stone walls to protect their barley and vegetable plots. They then let their most valuable asset, their livestock, roam freely in the enormous outfield of the surrounding hillsides. This was standard practice back in Norway, where the ecosystems were older, more robust, and could handle the pressure of grazing animals. But in Iceland, they were unleashing a powerful destabilizing force on an environment that had never evolved to handle it. The hooves of their sheep and goats, perfectly designed for grazing on tough Scandinavian grasses, cut into the delicate Icelandic turf. The native birch woodlands, whose roots were crucial for binding the soil, had been cut away. With the protective vegetation destroyed by grazing and the root systems removed by clearing, the incredibly light volcanic soil had no anchor. When the fierce North Atlantic winds blew, which they often did, or when heavy rains fell, the once stable earth simply vanished, stripped away in great clouds of dust or washed down the slopes in muddy rivers. This wasn't a slow process. Within a generation or two in some areas, the settlers themselves watched as the very ground beneath their feet, the foundation of their new home, literally blew out to sea. The climatic challenges were even more stark. While the broader medieval warm period made settlement possible, the local conditions on these frontier islands were still far more extreme than anything in the Scandinavian homelands. In Greenland, the growing season was drastically shorter and cooler. The settlers, primarily Norse from Iceland, arrived in two main areas: the eastern settlement, which was slightly more hospitable, and the western settlement, which was significantly harsher. Here, their beloved barley, the absolute cornerstone of their diet and culture, simply refused to grow. This was a catastrophic cultural blow. A life without barley meant a life without bread, without porridge, and most painfully, without beer. They were forced to adapt their entire nutritional strategy, becoming even more heavily reliant on their livestock. Their diet shifted to one dominated by dairy products, meat, and, crucially, what they could harvest from the sea. Archaeological evidence shows a gradual but steady increase in the bones of seals and caribou in their middens, proving that to survive, they had to supplement their failing pastoral economy with hunting, a practice that was perhaps looked down upon by the farming elite back in Norway. This necessity for adaptation is visible in the very bones of their farms. In Iceland and Greenland, the design of the longhouse changed. They built with even thicker walls of turf and stone, hunkering down against the wind and cold in a way that was unnecessary in the more sheltered Norwegian fjords. In the northern isles of Scotland, like Orkney and Shetland, which were already inhabited by the Picts, the Norse takeover was less about building new farms and more about taking over existing ones. Here, they encountered a different agricultural tradition. Instead of imposing their own two-field system wholesale, they often adapted to and integrated with the local practices, which included using seaweed as fertilizer on a massive scale, a technique they may have adopted and refined. In Ireland, the Norse established their famous coastal trading ports like Dublin and Waterford, but their agricultural impact was felt in the hinterlands through a different kind of exchange. They introduced new, heavier types of plows that were better suited to the heavier Irish soils, a technology that may have spread to the local Irish communities and increased agricultural productivity. The story of Viking farming in these new lands is therefore a profound and complex lesson in human ecology. It is a tale of incredible resilience and adaptability, of a people stubbornly clinging to their way of life in the face of overwhelming environmental odds. But it is also a stark, early lesson in the unintended consequences of exporting an economic system without a full understanding of the new environment. In Iceland, their insistence on applying Scandinavian methods to a volcanic island led to devastating soil erosion that persists to this day, a permanent scar on the landscape. In Greenland, their cultural refusal to fully abandon their pastoral identity and embrace the Inuit maritime lifestyle may have been a key factor in their mysterious and tragic disappearance from the island centuries later. Their greatest strength, their unwavering agricultural tradition, also became their greatest vulnerability. proving that no matter how sophisticated your methods, you must ultimately listen to the land itself. And so we arrive at the most haunting, cautionary tale in the entire Viking agricultural saga, the mystery of Greenland. For over 400 years, Norse settlers not only survived but built a thriving society in that brutal, beautiful landscape. They constructed stone churches, traded ivory with Europe, and maintained a way of life that was unmistakably, stubbornly Norse. At the heart of it all was their pastoral dream, a commitment to the farming identity they had brought with them. They raised cattle and sheep in a land where it was barely possible, a testament to their incredible resilience, and then they vanished. By the middle of the 15th century, the Norse settlements in Greenland were empty, leaving behind only silent ruins and one of history's most enduring puzzles. Why did their farming, at the very core of their existence, ultimately fail? For a long time, the prevailing theory pointed to a single, inescapable villain: the climate. The period known as the Little Ice Age began to grip the North Atlantic right around the time the Norse colonies were weakening. This was not just a few cold winters, it was a profound, long-term shift towards colder, more unpredictable weather. For the Greenland Norse, this meant shorter growing seasons, even less reliable sunshine, and longer, more ferocious winters. The already marginal hay harvests would have become dangerously insufficient. Winters stretched on, demanding more and more of the precious fodder stored in the barns. The sea ice, which surrounds Greenland for much of the year, would have expanded, blocking the vital fjords and making the seal hunting they did rely upon more difficult and dangerous. It's a compellingly simple story, a people defeated by a changing world they could not control. The cold literally froze them out of existence, but climate alone is not the full story. It was the interaction between this worsening weather and their own deeply ingrained cultural choices that created a perfect storm of failure. The Norse in Greenland were not passive victims of the weather. They were active participants in their own ecological destiny. Their most critical error was an unsustainable land management practice they imported from home: intensive grazing. In their determination to maintain a European-style pastoral economy, they kept large numbers of livestock, particularly sheep and goats, which are notoriously hard on vegetation. Their hooves trampled and cut the fragile Arctic turf, and their constant grazing prevented the native grasses and willows from recovering. Over centuries, this led to widespread soil erosion. The very land that supported them was quite literally vanishing from under their feet, blown away by the wind or washed into the fjords by rain, leaving behind the barren gravel scars we can still see today. They were loving their land to death, not through malice, but through a steadfast refusal to change a system that was fundamentally incompatible with Greenland's delicate ecosystem. This cultural rigidity extended to their diet and economy. Archaeological evidence from ancient garbage heaps, called middens, tells a revealing story. In the early days of the settlement, the diet was heavily reliant on domesticates: beef, lamb, and dairy products. As the centuries passed and times grew harder, we see a gradual increase in the bones of seals and caribou. They were adapting, but not enough, and not fast enough. Just a few days' journey away lived the Thule people, the ancestors of the modern Inuit, who had mastered the Arctic environment. Their survival was built on sophisticated seal and whale hunting techniques from kayaks and umiaks, using harpoons and other specialized tools. The Norse knew of these methods. There is evidence of both trade and conflict between the groups. Yet they never fully adopted this maritime hunting lifestyle. To do so would have meant abandoning their core identity as pastoral farmers, a psychological leap they seemingly could not make. They continue to see themselves as cattle farmers who sometimes hunted, rather than becoming hunters who also kept a few animals. This cultural myopia left them dangerously vulnerable when their farms began to fail. Compounding these environmental and cultural pressures was a crippling economic isolation. The Greenland colony's primary export, the thing that connected them to the European world and allowed them to import essential goods like iron, timber, and grain, was walrus ivory. They would hunt these immense creatures, whose tusks were highly prized for carving and luxury items, and shipped them back to Norway and beyond. But as the Little Ice Age advanced, the increased sea ice would have made these already perilous hunting expeditions even more dangerous and less frequent. At the same time, the European market for walrus ivory was collapsing. Elephants had become the new source for ivory, and their tusks were larger, easier to obtain, and considered superior. Suddenly, Greenland's only valuable commodity was rendered almost worthless. Trade ships from Iceland and Norway, which were their lifeline, began to visit less and less frequently, seeing no profit in the journey. The Norse Greenlanders were left utterly alone, cut off from the technological innovations, genetic diversity, and economic support of the wider Norse world, slowly shrinking into an isolated and impoverished relic of a bygone era. The end likely came not with a single dramatic event, but with a slow, grinding whimper. We can imagine a series of compounding crises, a string of terrible winters leading to livestock starvation, a failed hay harvest, a hunt that returned empty-handed. Malnutrition would have weakened everyone, making them susceptible to disease. The already small population would have dwindled further, making it harder to crew boats for hunting, maintain farms, or defend against potential conflict with the increasingly well-adapted Inuit. The last generations may have simply faced an impossible calculation: stay and slowly starve while clinging to a dying way of life, or attempt a desperate, probably fatal, sea voyage back to a distant homeland that had likely forgotten them. They chose to stay, and their world grew smaller and darker until the last fire in the last longhouse finally flickered out. The story of the Greenland Norse is not one of a people who were too weak, but of a people who were too strong in their attachment to an identity that the land itself could no longer support. Their disappearance stands as a powerful, eternal lesson in the perils of sustainability, a warning that the most dangerous thing a society can face is not a change in the climate, but an inability to change its own mind. But how can we be so certain about the daily rhythms and agricultural methods of a people who lived over 1,000 years ago? The answers don't just come from ancient sagas or rare written accounts. They are being dug up, sifted, and analyzed from the very earth itself. Modern archaeology has given us a powerful lens into this world, transforming scattered clues into a coherent picture of Viking farming life. The most vital evidence doesn't come from glittering treasure hoards, but from something far more humble: the dirt, the seeds, and the subtle traces of human activity left behind. One of the most revealing fields is paleobotany, the study of ancient plant remains. Archaeologists carefully take soil samples from sites like old rubbish pits, storage areas, and the floors of longhouses. By washing this soil through fine mesh screens in a process called flotation, they can recover a stunning array of botanical evidence. Charred seeds are a common find. Grains like barley and rye were often accidentally dropped into the fire during cooking or parching to remove their husks, carbonizing them and preserving them for centuries. By identifying the types and proportions of these seeds, researchers can determine exactly what crops were being grown and eaten. Even more telling is the analysis of pollen grains, which are incredibly durable. By taking core samples from nearby peat bogs and lake beds, scientists can create a timeline of the local vegetation. A sudden spike in barley pollen followed by an increase in weeds typical of disturbed ground provides clear evidence of forest clearance and the establishment of a new field, allowing us to literally chart the expansion of farmland across the Viking Age. Beyond the plants themselves, the very chemistry of the soil holds secrets. Through soil micromorphology, scientists examine thin slices of earth under a microscope to see the individual layers of history. In a Viking home field, they can identify the telltale crystals of phosphate that leach from animal manure, creating a permanent chemical signature of intensive fertilization that lasts for a millennium. They can also find spherulites, microscopic, spherical particles formed in the guts of animals and excreted in their dung. Finding a dense layer of these in soil samples is a sure sign that this was once a site of animal penning, confirming the practice of stalling livestock to concentrate their valuable waste. Of course, the layout of the farms themselves speaks volumes. Through extensive excavation, we can see the clear, purposeful organization of a Viking homestead. The remains of sturdy stone walls clearly demarcate the protected infield area. We find the post holes and drainage ditches of outbuildings, specialized barns for hay storage, byres for animals, and pit houses that served as workshops or underground storage spaces. The placement of these buildings in relation to the main longhouse and the fields reveals a highly efficient, integrated operation designed to minimize labor and maximize productivity. Perhaps no single site brings all this evidence together more vividly than the farm of Sturng in Iceland's Thorn-Jorsaldalar Valley. This farm was not abandoned and slowly fell into ruin. It was frozen in time in a single, catastrophic moment. Around the year 1100, the nearby volcano Hekla erupted violently, burying Sturng and the entire valley under a thick layer of volcanic ash and pumice. This covering acted like a perfect preservative, sealing the farm intact much like the volcanic ash at Pompeii. When archaeologists excavated Sturng, they found a perfectly preserved snapshot of 11th century life. The walls of the longhouse and its outbuildings stood waist high. Inside, they found the carbonized remains of the last meal left in the cooking pot. Outside, the boundaries of the home field were clear, and the analysis of the soil within it showed the intensive manuring and cultivation. The tragedy for the family who lived there became an unparalleled gift for historians, providing an incredibly complete and uncontested blueprint of a working Viking-era farm, down to the smallest detail of its daily operation. But how do we move beyond these silent clues and ancient texts to truly understand the feel of Viking farming? How do we grasp the sheer physical effort of guiding an ard behind a team of oxen, or the blistered hands from a day spent reaping with a sickle? This is where history leaps off the page and into the field, through the fascinating discipline of experimental archaeology. Instead of just studying artifacts behind glass, researchers literally get their hands dirty, recreating Viking tools and techniques to test them in the real world. It's one thing to read about a scratch plow in a book. It's entirely another to feel its wooden handle strain against the unyielding earth, to understand its limitations and its brilliance through the ache in your own muscles. Across Northern Europe, dedicated open-air museums have become living laboratories for this kind of research. Places like the Fotviken Museum in Sweden or the St. Fagans National Museum of History in Wales have reconstructed entire Viking Age farmsteads, complete with authentic longhouses, forged tools, and plots of land cultivated using only the methods available 1,000 years ago. Here, historians, archaeologists, and even volunteers don period clothing and step into the boots of Viking farmers for entire growing seasons. They are not reenactors performing for a crowd. They are scientists gathering data on everything from crop yields and soil depletion to the calories burned and the time required for each backbreaking task. This process transforms abstract theories into tangible, measurable reality. One of the most revelatory experiments involves the ard. A team will carefully breed and train oxen to pull a perfectly crafted replica based on archaeological finds. The first lesson is always one of immense physicality and patience. The ard is not a tool for speed. It requires constant, careful guidance. The iron share tends to bounce over obstructions or skid off course, requiring the farmer to lean his full weight into it to maintain a shallow, consistent furrow. A single day of plowing a small field becomes an exhaustive workout, a battle of wills between man, animal, and soil. These experiments have shown that the ard is remarkably effective at what it was designed to do. It creates a perfect seedbed in thin, rocky soils without causing the erosion a deeper plow would trigger. But the data also reveals its limitations, proving that a Viking farmer could only work a limited amount of land each season, making the intensive management of the ton not just a choice, but a necessity. The harvest brings another wave of grueling experimentation. Using replica iron sickles, volunteers set to work reaping a field of tall barley. The action is nothing like the sweeping motion of a scythe. It is a precise, repetitive, stooping labor. Grasping a handful of stalks, the reaper hooks the sickle underneath and pulls with a sharp, cutting motion. The blade must be kept razor sharp, as a dull edge will mash the stalks rather than slice them cleanly. After just an hour, backs ache from being bent double, and hands are raw from the friction. Timing these efforts has given historians a startlingly accurate measure of the labor investment. It might take a small team several days to harvest a single acre, a pace that seems agonizingly slow to modern eyes, but was simply the relentless rhythm of the Viking autumn. This first-hand experience confirms why the entire community, and likely every available thrall, would have been mobilized for this critical window of work. Beyond the tools themselves, experimental farms test the broader agricultural system. They practice the Viking methods of crop rotation and fertilization, spreading gathered seaweed or recycled manure from their own resident animals onto the plots. They then measure the yields against control plots that are left unfertilized. The results are striking, consistently demonstrating that these ancient practices were not mere superstition. They were empirically proven, effective techniques that could reliably boost production by a significant margin. This data helps explain how the same ton could remain productive for centuries. Their methods genuinely worked. Perhaps the most profound insights, however, are not about yields or labor hours, but about the intangible human experience. Spending a season on such a farm reveals the incredible depth of knowledge a Viking farmer must have possessed. It's not just about knowing how to swing a sickle, it's about reading the weather in the clouds, understanding the exact moment when the hay is perfectly dry to avoid rot, knowing how to care for an ox's hooves, or sensing the right soil consistency for planting. This was a sophisticated science, passed down through generations through direct practice and oral tradition. Experimental archaeology bridges the millennium, allowing us to not just know about Viking farming, but to, for a fleeting moment, understand it from the inside, feeling the profound connection between human effort, ingenious tools, and the demanding generosity of the earth. The choices made by Viking farmers 1,000 years ago did not fade with the sagas. They were carved directly into the earth itself, leaving a legacy that still defines the landscapes of the North Atlantic. This was not a gentle touch upon the land, but a fundamental reshaping, a mix of brilliant adaptation and, in some places, unintended but devastating consequence. To understand this lasting impact, we need to journey to Iceland, where the Viking agricultural dream collided with a uniquely fragile environment. The settlers arrived during the warm period and saw a land of stunning opportunity, lush grasslands and sheltered valleys that seemed perfect for their pastoral way of life. They set about recreating the world they knew, establishing their protected ton for barley and releasing their most valuable asset, their sheep and goats, to graze freely in the vast outfield. But the island's ecosystem was built on a delicate balance. The soil was largely volcanic tephra, a light, ashy substance held in place by a thin skin of vegetation. The native birch forests, whose roots bound this soil together, were seen not as a vital stabilizer but as a resource to be used. They were cut for timber, for fuel, and to clear land for grazing. The hooves of their livestock, perfectly suited for the tougher grasses of Norway, cut into the fragile Icelandic turf. The result was catastrophic and irreversible erosion. Without the anchoring roots and vegetation, the precious soil had no defense against the fierce North Atlantic winds and rains. Within generations, the settlers themselves witnessed the very ground beneath their feet literally blowing away in great clouds or washing into the sea, leaving behind the barren, gravel-strewn deserts that still scar the Icelandic interior today. This was not a slow geological process. It was an ecological accident, a permanent lesson etched into the hillsides about the profound consequences of applying an agricultural system to a land without fully understanding its fragility. Yet in other regions, the Viking agricultural footprint was less about ecological change and more about laying the very foundations of the modern countryside. Nowhere is this more evident than in the Danelaw, the vast region of eastern and northern England that fell under Norse rule and settlement. Here, the Vikings did not find an empty land, but a sophisticated Anglo-Saxon society with its own farming traditions. Rather than simply imposing their own methods, they often integrated and reinforced existing patterns, but they also left an indelible mark on the organization of the land itself. Their settlement patterns, driven by that core unit of the independent farm or boo, influenced the development of villages. The famous Scandinavian by ending, meaning a farm or settlement, is scattered across the English map like breadcrumbs from history. Think of towns like Grimsby, Derby, or Whitby. Each name whispers of a Norse farmstead that once stood there, a focal point for the surrounding fields. Beyond place names, the very shape of the fields can sometimes betray Norse origins. In some areas, the implementation of open field systems with long, narrow strips allocated to different farmers may have been influenced by Scandinavian concepts of land division and inheritance. The Vikings were pragmatic administrators as much as they were farmers. They saw the land as a system to be organized, and the structures they helped establish, from village layouts to field boundaries, became fossilized over centuries, gradually evolving into the landscape we recognize today. This tangible legacy extends beyond soil and stone into the very language we use to describe the land. The Vikings were not silent occupants. They named the places they lived in and the features they used, and thousands of these Old Norse names persist, acting as a permanent cultural overlay on the maps of the British Isles and beyond. In Scotland's Shetland and Orkney Islands, where Norse rule was long and profound, nearly every hill, bay, and valley bears a Norse name. A dale or dalar means a valley, giving us places like Eskdale. A Fjall or fell is a mountain, as in Scafell Pike. A vik is a bay, leading to names like Lerwick, even common terms filtered into everyday English. The word husband itself originates from the Old Norse husbandi, meaning the master of the house, directly tying the concept of marriage to the management of a farmstead. These words are not just historical curiosities. They are active, living reminders that the landscape was seen, understood, and narrated through a Viking lens. Every time we use these terms or see these names on a signpost, we are engaging with the agricultural world they built, a world that prioritized the home field, the valley, and the grazing shore. Perhaps the most profound and subtle legacy lies in the development of distinct land tenure systems, particularly the concept of feudal law found in northern Scotland, especially in Orkney and Shetland. This is a unique form of allodial land tenure, meaning land is owned outright without any feudal superior or obligation. It stands in stark contrast to the feudal system that came to dominate most of medieval Europe, where all land was technically owned by the crown and granted to lords in exchange for service, who then had peasants work it. Feudal law is a direct descendant of the Viking odel right, the belief that a free farmer owned his land absolutely, an inheritance from his ancestors to be passed to his heirs. This Norse concept of independent landownership survived centuries of political change. It created a society of sturdy, independent freeholders, a class of farmers who owed rent and service to no local laird, but were masters of their own destiny, much like the odelsbandi of ancient Norway. The persistence of feudal law is a remarkable legal fossil, a testament to the enduring power of the Viking idea that a man's true worth and freedom were rooted in the unchallengeable ownership of his own soil. It shows that their most lasting impact wasn't just on the physical shape of the land, but on the very idea of who could own it and what that ownership meant. Yet to fully appreciate the sheer ingenuity of Viking farming, we must step back and view it not in isolation, but on the global stage of the early medieval world. How did their struggle with the soil compare to that of their famous contemporaries, like the organized Anglo-Saxons in England or the powerful Frankish Empire on the European continent? At first glance, they shared a common agricultural toolkit that defined the era. The scratch plow, or ard, was the near-universal instrument for preparing the earth from the fjords of Norway to the fields of Francia. Virtually every farming society understood the necessity of some form of crop rotation to prevent the land from becoming exhausted, and all relied on the irreplaceable muscle power of oxen to pull their implements. The fundamental challenges of weather, pests, and soil fertility were a shared burden across the medieval world. But this is where the surface similarities end and a crucial, defining difference emerges: environment. While the Frankish heartland around the Rhine and Seine rivers consisted of some of the most fertile, deep and workable loam soils in all of Europe, and Anglo-Saxon England enjoyed a relatively mild, wet climate perfect for growing wheat. The Vikings were playing the game of agriculture on the hardest difficulty setting imaginable. Their homeland was one of dramatic and often brutal marginality. Scandinavia is a landscape dominated by thin, rocky soils, steep slopes, a short and unpredictable growing season, and long, sunless winters. This wasn't a choice, it was their geographical reality. So while a Frankish or Anglo-Saxon farmer could focus on maximizing yield from inherently generous land, the Viking farmer's entire existence was a masterclass in risk mitigation and adaptation to limitation. Their success is not measured by the sheer volume of their surplus, but by the fact that they managed to create a stable agricultural surplus at all under such punishing conditions. This environmental pressure forged key differences in technology and practice. Take the plow, for instance. While the ard was common, many Frankish and some Anglo-Saxon regions on heavier soils had begun to adopt a more advanced tool, the heavy moldboard plow. This was a massive, wheeled contraption with a curved iron blade, or moldboard, that was designed to do something the ard could not: slice deep into the earth and completely invert the sod, burying weeds and bringing fresh nutrients to the surface. It was a powerful tool for transforming thick, wet, clay-rich soils into magnificent farmland. But in the rocky, thin-soiled fjords of Norway, the heavy plow would have been a useless, broken nightmare. The Viking ard, in its elegant simplicity, was the perfect adaptation. It was lightweight, maneuverable, and didn't shatter on hidden stones. It conserved the precious topsoil on slopes where the moldboard's deep cutting would have caused catastrophic erosion. Their inferior tool was, in fact, the superior technology for the world they inhabited. This theme of adaptation to marginality extended to their social structures. In the feudal Frankish world, agriculture was organized around the sprawling manor estate, owned by a lord and worked by serfs who owed him labor and a large portion of their harvest. This was a top-down system designed to extract wealth from the land for a privileged elite. The Anglo-Saxons had a more mixed system of free peasants and larger estates. The Vikings, however, operated on a different model entirely, centered on the independently owned family farm, the odel. This wasn't just a quaint difference, it had profound implications. A freeholder farming his own land for his family's survival has a deeply personal, vested interest in every inch of soil. He is more likely to painstakingly clear it of stones, to carefully manage manure, and to innovate in small, incremental ways that improve resilience. This decentralized, bottom-up approach fostered a fierce independence and a culture of pragmatic experimentation that was perfectly suited to squeezing a living from a hard land. Their success was a collective result of countless individual families striving for self-sufficiency, not the command economy of a distant lord. Perhaps the most telling comparison lies in what they chose to grow. In the rich soils of Francia and England, the prized grain was wheat. Wheat was the prestige crop, used to make fine, risen white bread for the tables of the elite. It demands good soil and a relatively long, stable growing season. The Vikings, by stark necessity, placed their bets on a much hardier staple, barley. Barley is tough, frost-resistant, and has a shorter growing season. It thrives in poorer soils where wheat would fail. From it, they made their dense, dark breads and, most importantly, their beer. This wasn't a culinary preference, it was a survival strategy. Their entire diet and economy were built around the most resilient crop available. Furthermore, their extreme reliance on livestock, and the life or death importance of the hay harvest to feed them through the winter, was a direct response to an environment where arable farming was always a precarious gamble. They built a resilient, multi-pronged economy where the failure of one element, the grain crop, could be offset by the health of another, the livestock, a redundancy that farmers in more forgiving climates had less need to develop. When we place Viking farming beside that of their contemporaries, their achievements come into a much sharper and more impressive focus. The Franks and Anglo-Saxons were cultivating wealth from land that was eager to provide. The Vikings were wresting survival from land that was fiercely resistant. They weren't just farmers, they were pioneering agronomists of the extreme north, specialists in marginal environments. This unique expertise became their secret weapon for expansion. When they sailed to Iceland, Greenland, and the Faroes, they weren't trying to impose a standard European agricultural model. They were applying a specific, hardened set of skills designed for exactly the kind of challenging, unforgiving landscapes they found there. Their methods were born of necessity in the hard school of Scandinavia, and that same relentless ingenuity allowed them to plant their flags and their seeds on the very edges of the known world. And so, the most enduring image we can now hold of the Viking Age is not a single moment of battle glory, but the quiet, cyclical rhythm of a life lived in partnership with the land. We began by asking you to trade the horned helmet for a simple felt cap, to lower the raised axe and instead feel the smooth, worn handle of an ard. Through this journey, we have uncovered a truth far more compelling than any myth. The Vikings were, first and foremost, masterful and adaptable farmers whose entire world was built upon the sophisticated, relentless pursuit of an agricultural surplus. Their legendary adventures across the seas were not the cause of their success, but a direct result of it. It was the silent, sun-baked labor in the home fields of Norway that paid for the timber and woven sailcloth of the longships. It was the carefully stored butter and barrels of dried fish from a well-managed homestead that provisioned those ships for their months-long journeys. The silver and silks brought back from distant shores were the glittering profit, but the initial investment, the venture capital for the entire Viking Age, was harvested from the soil. This was not a static, simple form of farming. As we have seen, it was a dynamic system of brilliant adaptations. They were soil scientists, intuitively understanding the need to replenish the earth with manure, seaweed, and ash in a closed-loop system of sustainability. They were risk managers, dividing their land into the intensively managed infield and the extensively used outfield to create a buffer against famine. They were master toolmakers, crafting the perfect ard for their rocky soils rather than stubbornly trying to impose an unsuitable technology. And when they sailed to new lands, from the windswept shores of Iceland to the stark beauty of Greenland, they carried this entire agricultural blueprint with them. Their success in these new worlds, and their tragic failure in Greenland, was a direct reflection of their ability, or inability, to adapt their deeply ingrained practices to entirely new and fragile ecosystems. Ultimately, this changes the very definition of Viking strength. True power was not measured solely by the sharpness of a blade, but by the depth of the hay stored in the barn for winter. A chieftain's influence was rooted as deeply in the number of his cattle and the fertility of his fields as it was in the number of warriors who followed him. The restless energy that propelled exploration was fueled by a population boom made possible by reliable harvests, and it was directed by younger sons seeking not just adventure, but a far more precious commodity, land of their own to farm. The raid, the trade mission, the exploratory voyage, these were the spectacular branches of a mighty tree, but the roots of that tree were always buried in the well-tended soil of the Scandinavian homelands. Therefore, the most complete and fascinating picture of the Viking Age is not found in the smoke and chaos of a sacked monastery, but in the crisp morning air of a spring day, with a farmer guiding his oxen to turn the earth once more. It is found in the communal anxiety of the hay harvest, where an entire village's future hangs on the weather. It is found in the worn key carried by the woman who managed this complex enterprise, the true captain of the home front. This story of the farmer within the warrior is not a less dramatic history. It is a more human one. It replaces a simplistic caricature with a nuanced portrait of resilience, ingenuity, and a profound connection to the seasons. It reminds us that history's most transformative eras are often built not on the clamor of battle, but on the quiet, determined, and humble struggle to feed a family, to sustain a community, and to sow the seed